Very warm welcome, Major General Tim Cross, commander of one of the 3 divisions of the Field Army, logistics specialist and now a military analyst. Very, very warm welcome to you. To us today. Let's get straight into the thick of it. Let's talk about Ukraine. We're into 850 plus days of this war.
Yep.
The West has done a huge amount to try and support Ukraine, try to up its chances of success. But as we speak, today Russia is on the front foot. Given the size, the scale, is a Russian victory inevitable in Ukraine?
No, I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's, and it depends, of course, how you define victory. I mean, the initial aim of this invasion, special military operation, was to take the whole of Ukraine, and Putin thought he would do that very quickly. They've been quite successful, obviously. They've got about 20% of the territory. They've had Crimea before that. But in real terms, it's been a pretty static battle, land battle, for quite a long time now. The air battle has been moving, and the maritime, the navy battle in the Black Sea and so forth has been moving. The land battle today, I see it as a sort of 1916 time, where relatively small areas of territory have been gained for quite large casualty rates. And Russia has certainly regained some territory, regained or taken more territory since the Ukrainian offensive, which really failed in the context of what they were trying to achieve. So how do we define victory in this? I think if Ukraine were prepared to say, OK, we will hold and we will negotiate on what you've got, Putin would probably take that today and present it as a victory. But it certainly isn't the victory that they hoped to have in the beginning.
But do you think there is even a chance? I mean, there's a lot of discussion with Zelensky trying very hard to say we're still holding out, we're going to get the Russians out of all of our territory. It seems increasingly that's potentially a naive ambition. I think particularly of Crimea, the military history.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate about, the Crimea was only handed to Ukraine when it was a former county of the Soviet Union. The port of Sevastopol is strategically really vital for Russia for so many reasons.
Yeah.
It just feels, I'm not quite sure. People talk about winning and losing in these wars. I just don't know what that means in the context of Ukraine.
Because most wars end up in some sort of negotiated settlement. Occasionally you end up with a catastrophic defeat, in inverted commas, Germany in 1945. So my own instinct is there will have to be some sort of negotiated settlement to this. Ukraine recapturing this territory, I don't think it's naive. I think Zelensky wants that to happen, and a lot of Ukrainians still want that to happen. The latest opinion polls show that they still believe that they can happen, and a very small percentage, I think the last one was 5%, believe that Russia will actually push through and so forth. But it's only achievable. There's a number of things that need to be in place. And this is all about the capability of delivering fighting power. The physical component is the stuff. And we've been very supportive, but we have drip-fed in over this last couple of years that hardware that's necessary in order to create what we call the physical component of fighting power, and the logistics to sustain it, and so on. Then there's the conceptual piece. And we have been training a lot of Ukrainian soldiers at the tactical level, we and others. But if you're going to conduct major war-fighting, counter-offensive operations, you've got to operate at the operational level of war. You've got to have people who understand operating at that level, corps commanders who have the ability to pull together, artillery and infantry and armour and logistics and communications and engineering and so forth. And I don't think the Ukrainians have got that capability. They haven't got the senior leadership that has been immersed in that. What they have got in spades is that third component we talk about, the moral component, which is the will to fight, the preparedness to die on the battlefield. And what does that look like? It's very difficult to define, but it includes all sorts of things like integrity and character and so on.
But it feels like, going on that tack though, it feels like Russia has been fighting sort of 19th century style of just highly attritional warfare.
Yep.
Don't really care how many people die, because eventually you're going to run out of bullets. And it feels like, those old days where you meet on a field, my army meets your army, we have a cup of tea and then we fight, and the last one standing wins. If you've got the bigger army, which Russia has greater resources available to it, surely that's a battle that Ukraine can't afford to get embroiled in. And yet it feels like gradually they're getting sucked into that highly attritional battle. And we don't hear about the casualties from Ukraine's side, But by all accounts, Zelensky's having to dip deeper and deeper into the pool of people, whereas Russia's using all sorts of tricks to augment its military.
It is, and there's no doubt that Ukraine is not getting the recruiting that it hoped to get. He was hoping to mobilise an army 1 million strong a couple of years ago. And we might come back to the corruption issue later, but a lot of young people, not dissimilar to America, Vietnam, people buying themselves out of being conscripted and so forth and leaving the country. He's definitely struggling with that. But you use the word attritional. I mean, the history of Russia is that it is an attritional way of operating. Zhukov, who was one of their greatest generals, I remember, as part of my own studies and so forth, he would say to his army, if you come across a minefield, you keep going. Because it's therefore, by definition, not a defended position by German troops. If it was, you would take casualties. Going through the minefield, you would take casualties. But one way or the other, you're going to press on. And we shouldn't forget that they lost more taking Berlin than we, the UK, lost in the whole of World War II. So that the whole mindset is an attritional-based mindset. Now, our counter to that, and the equivalent in the first Gulf War, for example, was this whole new way of thinking, way of operating, the maneuver warfare stuff, which is about outthinking as well as outfighting your enemy. And Ukraine, again, their mindset is still locked in a lot of ways into the Soviet Union way of operating, but I think they have come out of that. So.
But the weapons we use, I subscribe to that view. But the outthinking, the danger is for our audience. It looks like you just need to be smarter. But I think we looked at First World War, Second World War, and went, we never want to get dragged into that. We're going to start applying technology, and that technology costs a lot of money, and that's been where we focused our effort. The trouble is the volumes of this stuff that's used in warfare. We just can't provide the volumes, and therefore. Our very philosophy of the way we want to fight smarter is predicated on smarter munitions, but we can't get those to Ukraine in the volumes they need to be able to do that smart thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance between mass and technology. I happen to believe mass is still important in the context of this, both for our own military, but also particularly for the Ukraine military. But again, alongside that, the technology of the new systems like drones and so forth that have been developed. And going back to my earlier point, we have drip-fed in over time some capabilities, be they main battle tanks and armour, obviously early on the anti-tank weapons and so on. But we've never given them sufficient of those numbers to enable them to really conduct proper counter-offensive operations.
But that's led to an accusation, hasn't it, that when you and I were serving, Russia was a driving threat for some of our things. And actually there has been accusations that we're simply helping Ukraine enough to degrade Russia without us getting our fingers dirty. Russia is already massively degraded. NATO hasn't even got out of bed yet. And that sounds deeply cynical, but the danger is we have been sort of trying to keep a distance from this. Is therefore Ukraine actually being used and abused somewhat here?
I would say yes, to a degree, and I would say that you've got to go back to the nature of, or the responses from the various players in the West, however you want to define the West. Clearly, Germany, for example, had a very different relationship to Russia to we did. You've got countries like Poland and the Baltic states. They all see these things differently. I think there is definitely a sort of undercurrent that Ukraine is doing the fighting for us, and they are degrading the Russians. I do think we need to be careful about casualty rates. Casualties are notoriously difficult to pin down, and people are using all sorts of figures about how much Russia has lost and how much Ukraine has lost. And as you say, Ukraine is not prepared to release those figures, and I think we're speculating enormously. And traditionally, for every person killed, there have been about 3 or 4 that are injured. So people are using kill numbers, which I think are completely out of proportion. But nonetheless, the West, I think, has been seeing that we want Ukraine to hold out. There are those who I think are reluctant to see Ukraine win, however we want to define that, partly because of the potential for what Russia will do. Either way, actually, if Russia were now being seen to be pushed back and losing the ground, would they revert to, for example, tactical nuclear weapons? There's also a very strong cohort in Russia who are, further to the extreme than Putin, who would argue that we are now deadlocked, and the way we need to break that deadlock is to use tactical nuclear weapons in order to be able to conduct successful counteroffensives, in addition to dealing with the critical national infrastructure and so forth that they've been attacking. So I think the West has struggled to get its mind around what this wants to look like. There's been lots of positive comment and support, relatively a fair amount of stuff, but not enough to allow the Ukrainians to achieve the victory.
And what do you think will happen? Potential change of administration in America.
Yeah.
None of us ever know what's actually going on behind the scenes, but the public rhetoric and if it's true that Trump has been reviewing plans for, and of course he loves to do a deal, doesn't he? That's his, and if you look at this from a grand strategic perspective, is there a deal to be done? America is funding the war effort both financially and militarily. If you turn that tap off, whilst Europe is providing a similar level of money, it's nothing like that level of military capability. And therefore, it could almost be that Zelensky is asked to stay outside the room whilst he negotiates. And that has all sorts of long-term implications. But in this soundbite world of politics, do you think that's a risk?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that Trump has a different perspective on this. And he has been prepared to visit North Korea. He's prepared to meet Putin. He's prepared to talk, positively in inverted commas about Putin. Part of me says that's partly because he's of not a dissimilar mindset in the sense of how he intends to, to command and rule and be a president and so forth. He claims that he can solve all these things quickly. The reality is he won't be able to do that. But the change of emphasis could make a significant difference. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it relates to the other thing, which is about NATO as a whole. Trump threatening to pull out of NATO because of the funding issues and so on and so forth. So what we've seen, certainly in the last year, 18 months, is the European members of NATO beginning to realise they are going to have to spend more on defence. They are going to have to be prepared for the fact. I don't think America will abandon NATO, but it might well reduce quite significantly its preparedness to support NATO in the way that it has been in the past, partly because of the tilt of the Pacific and all that other stuff. So I think Europe being prepared to step into the gap is something that a lot of people are trying to get their minds around.
Do you think also that might have an implication, though, for we've lived through a generation where NATO has been the only grand alliance, defensive alliance, but seen by others as not particularly defensive. There seems to be a lot more effort now for Russia, North Korea, Iran, potentially China to start looking at what a counter to NATO might look like, and people call it an axis of evil, but it would be a counter to an American-led, this is the answer to global security, which of course it's not.
No.
Is the danger that some of this is that we've relied on NATO being the good guys, but actually by the very success of NATO, particularly expanding now, leads to a new Cold War, not just with Russia, but actually with a different axis of countries?
Yeah, I mean, whether it would be a Cold War in the sense that we saw it before, but I do think, you're opening up a really interesting conversation, which is one of my favourite quotes by Sun Tzu, is if you understand yourself and you understand the enemy, you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. I don't think we really understand what is going on between Russia, China, North Korea, and people like Iran. But more than that, about the way that quite a chunk of the rest of the world is viewing that. Countries like India and Brazil, large numbers of African countries, who have not been supportive of our stand on Ukraine. Now, why is that? Because I think partly because they see the West, as we understand it, as not crumbling, but there are edges of that which are crumbling. I mean, when you look at people like Putin and not Putin, the current U.S. president, Joe Biden, and so on. So I think there's something about who do we understand in the West who we are today and what we stand for and the values and so forth, and what are we prepared to do in order to hold firm to those, and do we understand what's going on? So, even as we speak, Russia, China and others are meeting in Kazakhstan under the umbrella of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement and so forth. And there are other nations going to that. Pakistan, Mongolia is going to it out of interest, and other countries too. And many of the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, who have been our allies for a long period of time, are part of that link. So getting our minds around what's that meaning and where's this going to go over the next 3, 5, 10 years.
But it's also because there is that element. How much of this is around economic partnerships of convenience? I think a number of the countries you talked about have very close economic ties,
Yep.
particularly China, that apparently I heard the other day owns 90% of the mines around the world that are mining, valuable minerals and
Yeah,
resources that are
particularly rare
vital. And you sort of think, yeah, okay, so they're now going to run the markets. Why would you, A, join NATO and take a view against China, or B, jump into bed economically with China? You may not agree with how they run their country, but hard currency keeps you...
It matters.
It matters, yeah.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think, linked to that, these things are never, they're never simple, single-eyed solutions and so forth to this. There's a whole raft of things going on, not least of which is, we came to the end of the Cold War. And what did we think? The whole world, we argued, and many, wrote articles and books about this, argued, that the world would become free and liberal and democratic. We had won the ideas battle. That's no longer the case today. We in the West have been part of the problem to this. And the trouble is, when people try to speak into this, they can immediately be branded and dismissed. But the bottom line is, we made choices about going into places like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and engaging in places like Syria and elsewhere, and we haven't done a good job. And a lot of countries around the world recognize the reality of that and are beginning to say, do we want to side simply with the West, or at least... And I think many of them are saying, we don't want to side just with the West. We want to sit in the middle of this and try and play both ends off against the middle, if you like. And the economic argument is certainly a part of that.
Which is exactly what Vietnam was doing the other day, I think. It doesn't want to jump into sides for fear of... But economically, like most countries, they want to do what's right for their country. Going back to just Ukraine, just tactically for a moment. Sure. As a former senior military commander, as you said, you've got to have a strategy here. You do wonder, we're thinking more agile. Do you think that if Ukraine was to try to target Crimea and threaten, if not take, Crimea back, is that the centre of gravity for Putin?
I think there's a strong argument to say that is the case. Now, again, whether we like it or not, we need to understand why Putin thinks the way he did. So we know that he thinks the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not World War II, and not all the people who died in the Patriotic War and so forth. And he feels very powerfully, A, about Crimea, and B, actually about Ukraine. The spiritual heartland of orthodoxy, Russian orthodoxy and other orthodoxies, is Kiev, is Ukraine. And therefore he feels very strongly about what we're talking about here. And Crimea, whether it's a centre of gravity or not, I think you could argue that it is a centre of gravity. If he thought he was going to lose Crimea, then I think there's an argument to say, would he use tactical nuclear weapons? Ultimately, I don't think so, but I think it would be on the table as an issue to be discussed.
Just because it's interesting, because if it was, then most military analysts say it's really difficult to do because Ukraine doesn't have a navy.
Yeah, quite.
But actually, it has managed to push Russia's navy right out.
It has.
So logistics, you're relying very heavily on the Kerch Bridge now.
Yep.
Ukraine's shown that it can take that out.
It could take it out even more, and it certainly pushed the Russian Navy back, beyond where it was originally. So I think there's definitely a threat there. But I suspect behind the headlines, in a way reflecting our earlier conversation, I rather suspect that quite a few senior leaders are whispering in Zelensky's ear, "Don't try and take the whole of the Crimea. Cut it off by all means. Isolate it by all means. Hit it with weapons and so forth, like Storm Shadow and so forth, by all means. But don't think about taking Crimea, certainly until you manage to achieve, more success elsewhere."
Yeah, but it's just an interesting question, isn't it? That if you wait till you do more success, you might be waiting a long time.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas if you were to threaten Crimea, would that force Putin to have a slightly different view?
I don't think Putin wouldn't walk away. Putin is not going to walk away from this.
No.
I don't think. I mean, who knows?
But okay, so let's return to Putin just for a second then. You characterised it as Putin was hurting, as if all of the Soviet Union hurting, whatever. That is certainly a view. What about the view, though, that Ukraine has a whole mass of resources underneath the soil?
Sure.
And therefore, if you want to make Russia great again, which was undoubtedly one of the things, then certainly to the east, the Donbass region, but actually a lot of Ukraine has huge amounts of mineral deposits. Do you think this is... that sounds less altruistic than returning the Ukraine back to the motherland?
Yeah. If I'm honest, I don't think that Putin and the rest of the cabal sat down and used that as an argument for moving into Ukraine. Again, we need to understand Russian history. We may not agree with it, we may not like it much, I'm actually reading a book at the moment called The Abyss, which is about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
We were talking about that just the other day, actually.
And Khrushchev and so forth. And he makes the point in there that Russia, wants to be a nation that is respected, genuinely believes it's a world power and so forth. And I think Russia, again, I'm conscious of people like Nigel Farage speaking into this conversation, but, as we've expanded, as the EU's expanded its borders and so forth, I think Putin and the cabals were genuinely saying, we need to stop this. And Ukraine is has been historically, although long history, Ukraine hasn't been part of Russia, but nonetheless, for the recent past. So they wanted to, get Ukraine, stop it becoming part of NATO, hold the line, and yes, of course, there would then be other benefits to that, including the rare earth materials and so forth you've talked about. But I don't think it was the primary driver.
Yeah, because you look back and go, if the objectives were to stop the expansion of NATO, it's had quite the opposite effect.
It has.
If it was to make Russia great again, Putin's now indicted by the International Criminal Court, can't travel.
Yep.
Sanctions may not be the most effective, but they do seem to be, over time, prevailing. So the question is, how does this end? There's a lot of analysts say now that whilst Putin remains on the front foot, you characterised how these wars end, either catastrophic defeat or both sides get to a grinding halt and they frankly are just in stalemate. So you either have a frozen conflict or you have a conversation. It doesn't feel like Russia's ever going to get caught in a stalemate. It's just going to keep grinding.
I would say so. I mean, has Putin achieved those aims? Clearly he hasn't. I mean, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO and so forth, and the Baltic states, and others spending a lot more money on defence, he clearly hasn't achieved that aim. I don't, again, who knows, but often people talk about this in the context of Korea and the divide between North and South, and maybe there would be some sort of line, where there's a frozen conflict. It's not a peace agreement, it's not a negotiated settlement, but we just hold the line. And I think, understandably, from people like Zelensky's point of view, okay, but go back to 2014, wait 4 or 5 years, have another crack. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I don't think Putin is going to walk away from this. And he's not going anywhere for a while. I think the suggestion that he might be overthrown or kicked out is frankly wishful thinking.
Well, that's my final point really about it, was whether or not Russia has a history of having sort of these sharp resets every now and again, because in an autocracy, Putin has all the power, but actually there's a lot of oligarchs and senior folks around him that enjoy living life around the world, having kids educated in private schools around the world and whatever. And once that's all stopped from happening, there are occasions in the history of Russia where there's a sharp reset. Yeah,
and you're right in saying that there are individual people now who can't do the sort of things that you're referring to. But I don't, you mentioned sanctions earlier on in the grand scheme of things. The bottom line is we are still buying Russian oil through places like India, which are simply refining it, and most of the world is buying it. So I don't think sanctions are hurting economically as much as people anticipated. There are other things that we may or may not do. Individuals being restricted in terms of travel and education and so forth, yes, to some degree, but our public schools are still full of Russians, alongside Chinese and all sorts of other people. So I don't. I may be wrong. We may wake up tomorrow morning, and who knows, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with things like Gaza and so forth, things change quickly overnight. So there's always a potential for that. It's a possibility. I don't think it's a probability. And I don't think Putin's
you remember Yevgeny Prigozhin though doing his march on Moscow, and there was that sort of sudden sense of, is this the moment?
Yeah, but it clearly wasn't the moment, and it clearly wasn't.
No, it clearly wasn't. But it was interesting how much of a wave that he got. It wasn't stamped out initially. It felt like potentially he was riding a wave of support.
Yeah, but I'm not. I don't. Again, I don't know the reality of the finer points of the numbers. But everything I read and understand from people that I know, and I know people who have been working in Moscow for various reasons over time, the majority of Russian people do support what's going on here. They're not against it in the sense that we're talking about overthrowing the regime. And whilst that continues, because that again, Russian history is that they quite like living under the sort of autocratic regimes that we're talking about here, and they genuinely believe too that Russia should be well established on the world stage, and this is part of making people respect us as Russians and respect us on the world stage. I don't like that much in one sense, but I think that's what's
no. So
we're
on the dawn of a general election. There's no money in this country. We've got lots of priorities. Why do you think we should care in the West what's happening in a country 1,000 miles away?
It's a very good question, And without opening up the conversation too far, again, if we go back to the end of the Cold War, we believed that we had achieved success. We believed the world would become free and so forth. We went through this period then of wars of choice, where we made conscious decisions to engage in places that they were not wars of national survival. And people like Tony Blair and others, I mean, famous Chicago speech that Tony Blair made in 1997, that as we look at the world around us, we cannot ignore what's going on, i.e. 800,000 killed in Rwanda, i.e. ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. We have a responsibility to do something, which eventually ends up with the UN talking about a responsibility to protect. And therefore and Kosovo was a success, we can come back to that, but so there was this feeling that we had to do something, we had to engage, we had to, conditional sovereignty, to use the academic phrase people like Hsu and so forth were others using at the time. And people genuinely thought that was the case. I think there's a change of heart in some of this stuff. Now, I don't want to walk away from that personally, because I happen to believe, we do live in a world where we have, we have to engage with it, and we have to, understand what we stand for and so forth, as I was saying earlier. We will not commit NATO ground forces to fight for Ukraine. I don't think we in the West are prepared to do that.
But the irony is, if we were to put a no-fly zone, for example, in there, almost certainly the Russians will have no answer to that.
Well, that may or may not, you would know better than I. And I remember the northern no-fly zones and indeed the southern fly zones in Iraq and so forth, which had an effect. Would Russia just simply accept that?
No, I'm saying it will complicate matters, but in a way, you can't be a little bit pregnant in this sort of thing. Sure. We're trying not to take sides by actually getting fights in, but we are providing.
And we have got people inside Ukraine doing all sorts of stuff, supporting and so forth. There is that, but I'm talking about something completely different. I'm talking about putting the equivalent of ARC into Ukraine. Yeah. And I think, to your point, it's not going to happen. No. So when we look at China, for example, and Taiwan and so on, it's another conversation. But America, Japan, and others in that region would say we have to engage with this. Would we be drawn into that? I doubt it. Certainly from a land point of view.
I was chatting to somebody the other day who said, we've got to shed this imperialistic ambition to be the police force of the world. There are some things where you've just got to let them sort it out. My counter was, but history shows if you don't deal with these things in the early stages, they can gain a momentum all of their own.
Yep, and therefore, what do we mean, if we still mean, by global Britain in the context of that? If we were having a conversation in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, which I happened to have visited in Iraq when I was there in 2003, we would have thought the Babylonian Empire would last forever. And we had a responsibility, and we had a reach and so forth. The Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, these empires all crash and burn eventually, mostly over time, and mostly because of they commit suicide rather than be murdered. And so I think we're at a point where Western civilization, the way going back to my earlier point, and our role as the British and others, our reach into the world, should we engage in some of these things, is A, questioned, and B, we don't have the capability to do some of this stuff, unless we're prepared to spend a lot more on defence in all sorts of arenas we might talk about. But at the moment, we're talking about moving maybe from 2, maybe to 2.5% with a new government when they can afford it. Well, dream on, I think, is the answer to that. So we'll have to wait and see.